The studio lights blazed down on Stephen as he leaned forward in his chair, the audience buzzing with anticipation. Tonight's guest was Elon Musk, a man whose name alone could ignite a room, for better or worse. The episode started innocently, enough with Stephen tossing out his usual blend of sharp wit and playful jabs about Elon's latest ventures, the kind of banter that kept viewers glued to their screens. But beneath the surface, something simmered. Stephen's eyes glinted with a purpose that went beyond the script, and as the crowd laughed at a quip about Mars colonization, he shifted gears. He brought up family, a topic Elon rarely touched, in public, and the air thickened. What kind of father abandons his own child, Stephen mused aloud, his tone dripping with accusation. Not just any child, but one who'd publicly cut ties with him, a daughter whose identity Elon seemed to reject at every turn. The audience hushed, sensing the pivot from comedy to confrontation. Stephen didn't hold back. He painted a picture of a man too consumed by his own ego to nurture a relationship, too rigid to accept a child who didn't fit his mold. Wasn't it telling, he pressed, that someone who claimed to innovate the future couldn't innovate a bond with his own flesh and blood? How could a genius who dreamed of humanity's survival dismiss the humanity of his daughter? The questions hung heavy, unanswered, as Elon sat across from him, his face unreadable, but his posture stiffening. Stephen leaned into the silence, letting it fester, his voice rising as he described a father who'd rather tweet cryptic nonsense than pick up the phone. The crowd murmured, some nodding, others shifting uncomfortably. This wasn't the usual late-night fare, and they knew it. Elon's wealth and influence couldn't shield him from this, Stephen argued, his words slicing through the room. He spoke of a daughter left to fend for herself emotionally, a girl who'd changed her name to escape his shadow, only to be met with cold indifference. What did it say about a man, Stephen demanded, when his child's rejection wasn't a wake-up? Call but a footnote. The host's tone grew brutal, unrelenting, as he accused Elon of failing at the one job that mattered more than any rocket launch or billion-dollar deal. Parenting wasn't a side project, he said, and Elon had flunked it, spectacularly. The audience was hooked now, their eyes darting between the two men, waiting for the guest to crack. Stephen's moral superiority radiated, his every gesture amplifying the image of Elon as a hollow shell of a father. But Elon didn't flinch, not yet. His hands rested calmly on the armrests, though his fingers tapped a subtle rhythm, betraying a storm brewing beneath. Stephen, emboldened, pushed harder, recounting rumors of Elon's dismissive comments about his daughter's transition, framing them as proof of a callous heart. The host's voice trembled with righteous anger, daring Elon to defend himself, to explain how a man with the world at his feet could stumble so badly at home. The segment ended with Stephen staring him down, the crowd hanging on the edge of their seats, hungry for a response. Would Elon take the bait? Could he justify the wreckage Stephen had laid bare? The tension was palpable, a powder keg waiting for a spark, and the night was only beginning. The studio pulsed with unease as Elon finally stirred, his gaze locking onto Stephen with an intensity that could have melted steel. The host had just finished his tirade, chest heaving slightly from the force of his words, confident he'd cornered his guest into a defenseless silence. But Elon's lips curled into a faint, unsettling smirk, the kind that hinted he'd been waiting for this moment. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and the room seemed to shrink around him. When he spoke, his voice was low, deliberate, slicing through the lingering echo of Stephen's accusations. He didn't rush to deny the claims about his daughter or plead for sympathy. Instead, he turned the lens inward, asking Stephen how well he knew his own kids, how many late nights he'd spent chasing laughs instead of tucking them in. Stephen blinked, caught off guard, but recovered quickly, his jaw tightening as he shot back with a defense of his own parenting. He wasn't the one on trial here, he insisted, steering the conversation back to Elon's failures. The audience leaned in, sensing the shift as Stephen doubled down, describing a man who'd let his daughter drift away while he obsessed over machines and headlines. Elon's face didn't change, but his eyes narrowed, tracking Stephen like a predator sizing up its prey. The host pressed on, voice rising again, painting a vivid scene of a child reaching out for acceptance only to Find her father too busy building empires to notice. It was raw, emotional, and the crowd ate it up, gasps rippling through the seats. Elon let the words hang for a beat, then struck. He didn't shout or flail. His calm was unnerving. He asked Stephen when he'd last spoken to his own guests. Kids, or if he'd ever bothered to dig beyond tabloid scraps before wielding them like a weapon. The question landed like a punch, and Stephen faltered, his rhythm breaking for the first time. The host tried to pivot, accusing Elon of dodging the issue, but the guest wasn't done. He spoke of sacrifices, of choices Stephen couldn't fathom, his tone steady but edged with something sharp. The audience felt it, a crack in the host's armor, as Elon hinted at a life Stephen had no right to judge, one shaped by pressures the comedian could only parody, not live. Stephen's face flushed, his confidence shaken, but he rallied, leaning into his moral high ground. He called Elon unfit, a father who'd failed not just his daughter but any child who'd ever looked to him for guidance. The words were venomous, meant to wound, and they did. Elon's smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of something darker. The host seized on it, describing a man whose legacy would be tainted not by business flops, but by the daughter he'd lost. The crowd was riveted, torn between Stephen's fury and Elon's eerie composure. The segment closed with the two men staring each other down, the air crackling with unspoken threats, as the audience wondered who'd break first. Elon's quiet defiance lingered, a promise of retaliation, and Stephen's bravado felt suddenly fragile. The tension in the studio thickened as Stephen straightened in his chair, determined to reclaim the upper hand. Elon's probing questions had rattled him, but he wasn't about to let the guest flip the script. The host's eyes flashed with renewed fire as he launched into a fresh assault, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. He spoke of Elon's daughter with a tenderness that bordered on theatrical, describing a young woman forced to forge her own path because her father couldn't muster the decency to support her. Stephen's words were deliberate, each one a hammer strike as he accused Elon of abandoning her, not just emotionally but morally, leaving her to navigate a world he'd made harder with his public stances. Elon sat still, his expression a mask of restraint, though his fingers had stopped their subtle tapping. Stephen took it as a sign of weakness, pressing harder, his tone growing more scathing. He painted Elon as a coward, a man who hid behind his wealth and eccentricity while his child suffered in silence. The host's voice cracked with emotion as he recounted the pain of rejection, the sting of a parent's indifference, drawing the audience into a shared outrage. People shifted in their seats, some nodding, others whispering, fully absorbed in the drama unfolding. Stephen was relentless, calling Elon a failure not just as a father but as a human being, unfit to guide anyone, let alone a vulnerable daughter. But Elon's silence wasn't surrender. When he finally spoke, his voice was a quiet blade, slicing through Stephen's momentum. He didn't raise it, didn't need to. The weight of his words carried the room. He asked Stephen if he'd ever considered the other side, the unseen struggles of a family fractured by more than headlines could capture. The host scoffed, dismissing it as an excuse, but Elon pressed on, his tone measured, yet piercing. He spoke of a daughter who'd made her own choices, a life he'd tried to reach but couldn't force, and a pain Stephen couldn't begin to understand. The audience felt the shift, a ripple of doubt cutting through their earlier certainty. Stephen bristled, sensing the crowd's wavering allegiance, and lashed out. He accused Elon of spinning a sob story to dodge accountability, his voice rising to drown out the guest's quiet intensity. He described a man who'd rather play victim than own his mistakes, a father whose neglect was a choice, not a tragedy. The host's fury peaked, his hands slamming the desk for emphasis, as he declared Elon's parenting a disgrace that no amount of genius could erase. The crowd was split now, some cheering Stephen's passion, others drawn to Elon's unflinching calm. The segment ended with the host panting, triumphant in his own mind, while Elon's steady gaze promised a reckoning still to come, leaving the room electric with anticipation. The studio lights seemed to dim as Elon's gaze held steady, unflinching against Stephen's fiery outburst. The host had just unleashed his most blistering attack yet, his desk still vibrating from the force of his hands, his chest puffed with the conviction of a man who'd landed a knockout blow. The audience was a sea of held breaths, caught between Stephen's righteous fury and the eerie stillness radiating from Elon. But that stillness shattered when Elon leaned forward, his voice cutting through the chaos like a cold wind. He didn't yell or gesture wildly. He didn't need to. He began dismantling Stephen's tirade with a precision that felt surgical, exposing the cracks in the host's sanctimonious armor. Elon spoke of complexity, of a life Stephen had reduced to a cartoonish villainy. He described a daughter he'd loved fiercely, a bond strained not by rejection but by choices neither could fully control. His words weren't a plea for pity. They were a challenge, daring Stephen to prove he knew more than the headlines he'd weaponized. The host's face twitched, his confidence faltering as Elon questioned his authority to judge a man's soul based on scraps of gossip. The audience felt the ground shift, their earlier outrage softening into uncertainty. Stephen tried to interrupt, his voice sharp with indignation, but Elon pressed on, his calm unraveling the host's bluster. Stephen scrambled to regain control, accusing Elon of deflecting, of hiding behind vague platitudes to avoid the truth. He leaned into the crowd, rallying them with a vivid image of a father too arrogant to admit his faults, too detached to feel his daughter's pain. But Elon's next move was devastating. He asked Stephen, point blank, how he'd fare under the same microscope, how his own kids would describe him after years of late nights and scripted sincerity. The question hung in the air. A mirror turned on the host and the room went silent. Stephen's mouth opened, then closed, his retort dying in his throat as Elon's words sank in. The guest didn't stop there. He spoke of resilience, of a daughter, carving her own path despite the world's scrutiny, a strength Stephen had ignored to fit his narrative. The host's earlier triumph curdled, as Elon painted him as the real coward, a man who'd rather tear down than build up, who'd exploit a family's fractures for applause. The audience was riveted, some shifting uncomfortably, others nodding, as Elon's quiet authority eclipsed Stephen's bombast. The segment closed with Stephen visibly shaken, his hands gripping the desk, while Elon sat back, composed, his point made without a single raised decibel. The power had shifted, and everyone felt it. The studio air crackled as Stephen gripped the desk, his knuckles whitening under the strain. Elon's last words had landed like a gut punch, turning the host's own sanctimony against him, and the audience could sense the tide turning. Stephen's eyes darted, searching for a foothold, his earlier bravado now a brittle shell. He forced a laugh, sharp and hollow, trying to dismiss Elon's counterattack as a desperate dodge. But the room wasn't buying it. The crowd's murmurs grew restless, their loyalty fracturing as Elon sat there unshaken, his presence a quiet rebuke to Stephen's unraveling control. The host had to strike back, and fast. He launched into a new assault, his voice booming with a mix of anger and desperation. He accused Elon of twisting the truth, of cloaking his neglect in noble-sounding riddles while his daughter languished in his shadow. Stephen's words were vicious, painting a picture of a man so consumed by his own myth that he'd let his child become collateral damage. He leaned forward, jabbing a finger toward Elon, calling him a fraud whose genius stopped at the nursery door. The audience gasped, drawn into the raw emotion, some cheering Stephen's ferocity, others wincing at its excess. He was fighting to reclaim the narrative, to bury Elon under the weight of his own failures. But Elon didn't buckle. His response was slow, deliberate, a predator letting its prey exhaust itself. He spoke of time, of years spent wrestling with a world Stephen could only mock from a cushy studio chair. He described a father who'd stumbled, yes, but who'd never stopped trying, a reality too messy for the host's tidy morality play. Then he turned the blade. He asked Stephen if he'd ever faced a choice that broke his heart, or if he'd always had the luxury of judging from afar. The question stung, and Stephen's face flushed, his comeback stumbling as Elon's words found their mark. The crowd felt the shift, a collective intake of breath as the guest's quiet intensity began to outshine the host's bluster. Stephen tried to rally, shouting over the growing unease, accusing Elon of playing the martyr to dodge accountability. He described a daughter discarded, a family shattered by a man too selfish to mend it, his voice trembling with a fury that felt personal now. But Elon's calm held firm, a wall Stephen couldn't breach. The guest's eyes locked onto the host, unyielding as he let the accusations crash and dissipate. The segment ended with Stephen panting, his energy spent, while Elon remained still, a figure of restraint amid the chaos. The audience was hooked, torn between the host's passion and the guest's unshakable resolve, sensing the battle was far from over. The studio hummed with a restless energy as Stephen sat back, chest heaving, his latest barrage still echoing in the room. Elon's unshakable calm had left him exposed, and the host's frustration was palpable, his hands twitching as if itching to claw back control. The audience watched, riveted, their earlier allegiance to Stephen's outrage now muddied by Elon's steady defiance. The host's eyes narrowed, a flicker of desperation igniting as he sensed the crowd slipping. He couldn't let Elon's quiet strength steal the night, not after he'd staked his moral high ground so publicly. He needed a knockout, and he went for it with everything he had. Stephen rose from his chair, pacing the stage, his voice booming as he unleashed a final, brutal takedown. He spoke of Elon's daughter with a searing intensity, describing a young woman betrayed by a father, too proud to bend, too cold to care. He accused Elon of turning his back on her when she needed him most, of letting his public persona devour his private duties. The host's words were a torrent, each one laced with contempt as he branded Elon a hypocrite who preached progress while failing the one person he should have lifted up. The crowd was swept up, some cheering, others stunned, as Stephen's emotion peaked, his voice cracking with a righteous fury that demanded a reaction. Elon didn't give him the satisfaction. He waited, letting Stephen's storm rage, his own silence a stark contrast that made the host's theatrics feel overblown. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low rumble, cutting through the noise with lethal precision. He didn't defend or deflect. He attacked. He asked Stephen how it felt to exploit a stranger's pain for ratings, to wield a family's fractures like a cheap prop. The question landed hard, and Stephen froze mid-step, his momentum snuffed out. Elon pressed on, describing a man who'd built a career on judgment but never faced the mirror. A host whose empathy was as scripted as his laughs. The audience gasped, the air shifting as Elon's words turned Stephen's crusade into a hollow performance. The host stammered, caught off guard, his face reddening as he tried to counter. He accused Elon of dodging the truth, but the words felt weak, overshadowed by the guest's unrelenting gaze. Elon didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to. His calm was a weapon, exposing Stephen's bluster as noise. He spoke of a daughter he'd never stopped loving, a story Stephen had no right to rewrite, and the crowd felt the weight of it, their murmurs turning to nods. The segment closed with Stephen sinking back into his chair, deflated, while Elon sat tall, his quiet triumph undeniable. The battle lines had redrawn and the host was losing ground fast. The studio lights bore down on Stephen as he slumped into his chair, the fight draining from his posture. Elon's last words had stripped away the host's momentum, leaving him exposed, a performer caught without a script. The audience sensed it too, their energy shifting from Stephen's fiery indignation to Elon's unyielding composure. The host's face twisted, a mix of anger and embarrassment, as he scrambled to salvage his dignity. He couldn't let Elon's quiet victory stand, not with the crowd watching, their murmurs growing louder, their allegiance teetering. He straightened, forcing a smirk, and launched one last desperate salvo, determined to drag Elon back into the mud. Stephen's voice rasped as he accused Elon of grandstanding, of crafting a noble facade to mask his failures. He painted a picture of a father who'd rather spin tales of sacrifice than face his daughter's rejection, a man whose ego had suffocated any chance at redemption. The host leaned into the crowd, his tone biting as he mocked Elon's calm as arrogance, a shield for a heart too brittle to feel. He described a child left to pick up the pieces of a family Elon had shattered, his words dripping with scorn, aiming to reignite the audience's outrage. Some clapped, clinging to Stephen's passion, but others hesitated, their eyes flicking to Elon, waiting for the rebuttal they knew was coming. Elon didn't disappoint. He leaned forward, his voice steady, but laced with a fire that hadn't surfaced before. He tore into Stephen with a ferocity that was all the more striking for its control, calling him out for turning a complex life into a punchline. He spoke of a daughter he'd fought for in ways Stephen couldn't imagine, of a bond tested by time and distance, but never abandoned. Then he pivoted, his gaze piercing the host, and asked how it felt to profit off pain, to play judge while hiding behind a desk. The accusation hit like a thunderclap, and Stephen's smirk vanished, his hands clenching as Elon exposed the hypocrisy at the heart of his attack. The crowd was electric, fully in Elon's grip now, their gasps punctuating the silence that followed. Stephen tried to interrupt, his voice cracking as he accused Elon of lying, but it was too late. The guest's words had taken root, and the host's flailing only deepened the hole. Elon sat back, his point made, his presence commanding the room as Stephen's authority crumbled. The segment ended with the host staring down at his desk, defeated, while Elon's steady gaze swept the audience, claiming the night. The tide had turned, and Stephen's brutal crusade had become his own undoing, leaving him small against the man he'd tried to destroy. The studio sat in a stunned hush as Stephen stared at his desk, the weight of Elon's words pressing down on him like a physical force. The host's hands trembled slightly, betraying the cracks in his once impenetrable facade. The audience, now fully captivated, watched with bated breath, their earlier cheers for Stephen's fury replaced by a quiet awe for Elon's relentless composure. The guest had turned the tables, not with theatrics or rage, but with a clarity that left Stephen nowhere to hide. The host's attempt to reclaim the narrative had failed, and the room knew it. The energy had shifted irrevocably, the spotlight now Elon's to command. Elon didn't gloat. He leaned back in his chair, his expression calm but resolute, and delivered his final blow. He spoke of a life Stephen couldn't comprehend, of choices made under pressures the host would never face, and of a daughter whose story wasn't his to judge. His voice carried a quiet strength, a father's resolve stripped of pretense, and it resonated. He turned Stephen's accusations inside out, framing the host as a man who'd built his throne on others' pain, a critic too shallow to grasp the depths he condemned. The audience leaned forward, some nodding, others wide-eyed, as Elon's words painted a picture of resilience, not failure, and of a humanity Stephen had overlooked in his rush to destroy. Stephen tried one last stand, his voice hoarse as he accused Elon of manipulating the crowd, of dodging the truth with pretty speeches. But it was feeble, a shadow of his earlier fire, and the audience barely stirred. Elon's gaze met Stephen's unflinching, and he asked a final question, how it felt to lose at his own game. The host's face crumpled, the fight gone, as the weight of his humiliation settled in. The crowd erupted, not in boos or jeers, but in applause for Elon, a wave of approval that drowned out Stephen's fading presence. The guest had turned the night into his triumph, not by shouting louder, but by standing taller, his dignity intact, while Stephen's lay in tatters. The segment closed with Elon rising from his seat, offering a nod to the audience as they cheered. Co-victor who'd needed no crown to claim the win. Stephen remained slumped, staring at nothing, his desk a lonely island in a sea of shifting loyalties. The cameras lingered on Elon as he exited the stage, his stride confident, leaving behind a host undone by his own hubris. The night ended with no loose ends, no questions left unanswered, just a clear, resounding conclusion. Elon had faced the fire and emerged unbroken, while Stephen's brutal judgment had burned only himself. The audience left satisfied, the story complete, a tale of confrontation and triumph sealed in one unforgettable clash.